Hello, Woodmont and Nashville community, coming to you at the end of the month of April, as we are probably 6 weeks or more into this quarantine time, hopefully looking to begin to reemerge here soon. And today I'm joined by a member of Woodmont, a friend of mine, and a very well-respected marriage and family therapist named Jim Schleicher. Jim has been in private practice for 40 years. So I feel like he's he's seen it all, and he's helped many people in their marriages and their families. And so, Jim, thanks for coming to talk and share some thoughts.
Good to be here.
We're living in stressful times, and that stress is being transferred into family life, marriage and family life. And so the first question that I wanted to pitch to you is, how are you seeing the stress of the quarantine period where everybody's kind of stuck at home? How is that playing out in marriages?
You know, there's really no one-size-fits-all. A lot of the folks that are part of this congregation are pretty highly functional people. And actually, people that are highly functional are probably doing quite well. They do really well in a crisis. 6 months down the road may be a different story. But a lot of people are doing really well right now. People that are struggling were probably doing some kind of struggle before this ever happened. I kind of resist the word stress. I want to just kind of reframe that what we know about marriage, what we know about family, is the choice is not whether it's hard or easy. The choice we always have is whether we make it good hard or bad hard. So I don't think I want to because we're in this kind of crisis, the virus does not give us permission to veto kindness, respect, and appreciation within a family.
Right. So it is, everybody that's ever been married or is married knows that marriage takes work. And so the question is, what are you going to do intentionally, whether it's during the quarantine or just in regular life, to do the things that you just said?
Well, when folks come into my office for the first session, usually I'll ask what brings you here. And the most typical response to that question is, we're not communicating. In the back of my head, I kind of begin to chuckle. You sure are. And one of the things we know about family is 93% of all our communication in family is nonverbal. And so the biggest question I want people to be asking themselves, even though it sounds a little abstract, is what is my presence in the presence of my family? What is it like for my kids to experience me? What is it like for my spouse, for my partner to experience me? Are they experiencing kindness and gentleness and softness and friendship? Or is there an impatience, a harshness, a little bit of an abruptness, just an abrasiveness about who I am? So I really think the challenge for all of us is at the 93% nonverbal level, which is where most of communication happens within family. What is it like for other people to be with me? And what is my presence with the people I love?
So would you say that with what's been going on, people working from home, children homeschooling, and they're still there at night, and basically families and couples are spending a lot more time together than they're used to spending. Maybe not the stress, but the pressure of that, does that make acting, kindly, civilly, respectfully, does that make it more challenging?
It makes it more challenging for sure, but it doesn't give us a buy on it. During this time, it really is hard it's quite an adjustment. My wife and I both work outside home. We're both at home a lot. Right. I can't say that adjustment is seamless. That's hard for all of us. Right. It exposes how we operate differently. And so we're all having to kind of make sense of how do we do this, but we can do it well if we choose to kindness, respect, and appreciation.
So I wrote a piece about how there's been a lot of talk about breaking points in the healthcare system and in the hospital system, and all that data is really important. But I think there's also a psychological and an emotional breaking point that happens with individuals and even with couples. And so my guess is that you've continued your practice throughout this. Are you seeing people kind of hit a wall and get really frustrated with each other in ways that maybe they wouldn't if they weren't spending so much time together?
Well, I think we need to be realistic about what life and family is like. My rule of thumb these days is that 5 out of 7 days within our family, we're doing pretty well. In fact, we may be doing better than pretty well. In the 2 days maybe that we're out of sync or we've hit the wall or in one or the other or somebody in the family, is that those 2 days are not back-to-back, but if we're hitting 5 out of 7 in family life, where we're doing pretty nicely as a system, then I think we ought to be grateful. That's probably a realistic expectation.
So we need to show ourselves a little bit of grace for the days that maybe we don't act the way that we know we should act, or treat our spouse or partner that way.
I think that's right, and all of us are sort of struggling with, what I hear a lot is we never quite know what mood we're going to wake up tomorrow. And we all are going to hit those bad days, and we're going to hit bad days, and we're going to just not be in sync. But if we can sort of monitor that in those days that are not so good, just be okay with that, and then get back up the next day and do better.
So I've known you for a while, and you've done a number of presentations at Woodmont, also to a lot of the schools in the Nashville community, and you talk a lot about anxiety. And so I'd be curious to get your thoughts on anxiety during this time as it relates to marriage, but also to the kids, to the children.
Well, before the pandemic, anxiety in our country was supposed to be is the number one diagnosis. It beats cancer, diabetes, cardiac stuff. Anxiety is the big deal. For the last 12, 15 years, it's easily been the number one diagnosis for kids and adolescents. Referrals in college counseling centers for anxiety is up 70% in the last 10 years.
Wow.
Hospitalizations for adolescents up 50% in the last 10 years. It's a big deal. And you make a really good point, Clay, oftentimes in your sermons about differentiating anxiety from fear. Yeah. Is fear, we got a sense of what it is that we're afraid of. Anxiety is just this sort of underlying, not quite sure what's not right, but something isn't. And that's a big deal. And then I think the pandemic just simply increases that sense. And one of the things in family life we want to pay attention to, it kind of goes back to what is my presence in the presence of people, is I seldom, if ever, see an anxious kid. It's almost always an anxious family. If you are an anxious parent, you're 7 times more likely to have an anxious kid. So it's that. And several points I would make about that anxiety. Number one, it's the most contagious emotion we have. You can't be around it without catching it. If I'm doing a session in my office with a couple, both of whom are highly anxious people, they walk out my door, I am wired. And I learned how to use that diagnostically, but you can't be around anxiety without catching it. It's that contagious.
Okay.
Secondly, it's the most physical emotion we have. It affects blood flow to the heart. It affects oxygen to the brain. The first 3 things that go out the window when we get anxious are concentration, creativity, and memory. And so what do kids need to learn? Concentration, creativity, and memory. I was in a Zoom call with some school counselors yesterday, and they had just finished watching a webinar, and some data coming out about how this pandemic is affecting kids' capacity to learn. And for what it's worth, the thing that at least they're observing right now is working memory seems to be much harder for kids. It sort of hits the point with this, we're doing everything differently, but not only that, by the time we get through with this, counseling is going to be different. I used to hate phone sessions. I used to hate FaceTime sessions.
Right.
I'm glad we got them now.
Right.
But it's certainly not the same as picking up the energy in a room, just like it's not the same as talking here in front of a camera in this empty sanctuary where you don't feed off the energy.
It's a totally different dynamic, but it's going to be, it's almost like it's going to be here to stay. And Zoom, a lot of people never even heard of Zoom before March, and now it's, a very common way to communicate.
And glad we got it.
That's right. We got
it.
It's better than the alternative of not having anything.
But I think the whole notion of anxiety affecting our ability to learn is we're learning more and more about kids. And the meanness of anxiety is the number one sort of symptom of anxiety is perfectionism. So you got kids who are anxious that have perfectionism, and their concentration, creativity, and memory is shot. And so they're having to bulldoze their way through life. They're doing typically fairly well, but just not enjoying being a kid. But the physicality of that is so important. The third thing about anxiety, and this goes with parents, is when you get anxious, it immediately leads to catastrophic thinking. There's no continuum. You don't pass go. You go immediately to the worst case scenario. You get a highly anxious parent, and they get a note home that the kid missed a homework assignment. They got that kid in juvie, promiscuous, on drugs. I mean, they go to the worst case scenario, and that's where they live.
I gotcha.
And then finally, the anticipation of it creates it. If you think you're going to be anxious next Thursday, it might as well be next Thursday.
I see. So I guess, it is true then that if parents are anxious or fearful because of what's going on, and it's making them act in a different way from how they would normally act with each other and around their children, the children are picking up on that and they're catching it. And so in a sense, it would be understandable why there's even more anxiety during this period than there was before, and there was already a lot.
That's true. And it goes both ways. We pay a lot of attention about what parents do to kids. We don't pay as much attention to what kids do to parents. You got an anxious kid, that's going to trigger the parent's anxiety, going to trigger the kid's anxiety, and then you just get a stimulus response chain where the anxiety in the whole system just gets ratcheted up.
I want to come back to something that you said. You said that if there were problems in a relationship before this started, then those problems have probably continued. And maybe the same way, if a relationship was in a healthy place before all this started, then maybe that couple is handling this better. What are the intentional things that couples should be doing in their relationships, in their marriages, during this time when they're seeing a lot more of each other than they're usually used to seeing?
At the expense of belaboring the point, the number one thing is pay attention. What is it like to be around me?
Right.
And am I in charge of that? Secondly, is I'm finding it really helpful with families to make a list of these are the things we're in control of, and these are the things we have no control over. And making sure that our energy is focused on the things that we can influence, things we can impact, things that we can make sense of. And not spending a whole lot of energy watching the news and getting all wound up in things that we really have no ability to influence.
Right.
But we do have the ability to influence who we are in the midst of this.
Okay. And then would you say that that fear and anxiety and uncertainty, for whatever reason, causes us to treat the people that deserve our best in a harsher way, not because we do that intentionally, but because we are afraid?
I think that's right, but I think we are obligated to develop the skills to manage anxiety. Interestingly, if I talk to other therapists and counselors, is people that have already managed their anxiety are typically doing better than the general population because they already got the skills in place to manage their anxiety.
Interesting.
Whereas the general public don't have these skills available to them, having to learn them. I think the anxiety stuff is just so huge right now that we're obligated to figure out what in our own system do we need to do about it.
Can you talk a little bit about this dynamic of children going to school at home? And one of the things that's so sad about this deal is that they're missing seeing their friends, except for on the computer. They're missing out on birthdays and things like that. So how are children, at different age groups, whether it's high school, middle school, elementary, how are they being impacted just by the drastic changes that have happened this spring?
We don't know, we just know it has an impact. One of my favorite gimmicks, I learned this last week from a lower school counselor. She had families in the school, had 3 boxes. And one was a shoe box, one was a box about this big, and one was a box about this big. And when a kid brought a problem to the family, the first thing you had to decide is which box does this go in? Let me give you not a funny, but a poignant story about that. It's not funny at all. Was talking with a boy yesterday, an adolescent boy, and he was really missing his dad. It's a divorce situation, and his dad is vulnerable because of some underlying medical conditions. He hadn't been able to see his dad in 6-7 weeks, and he was really saddened by that. And so I said to him, which box does this go in? He said, first of all, in the big box, I would put that if I were around my dad and he were to get sick and if he were to die, I would feel bad the rest of my life. That's a big problem. Missing my dad, that's a problem, but that's not in the big box. That's over here. And so he and I had this conversation about, isn't it really cool that you and your dad are both sad about not being with each other? Is that not the neatest thing, that you care enough about each other that you're really sad to be apart? He said, yeah, that's pretty good. He said, I think I'll take that out of the medium box and put that down in the little box. And I just think figuring out ways to help kids in this time, it is a problem, not being around friends, not being that kind of stuff, but it's not in the big box.
Right. And hopefully it's temporary and it's not going to last forever, even though I would be curious as we kind of begin to get into this situation where we're going to reopen society, and Nashville's got a 4-phased, reopening plan. What advice would you give to parents about how they should approach reopening and when they should say, play dates are okay, and because this is all new to everybody, including therapists. But what would you say in terms of the fear and anxiety that's present about, okay, when is it okay to, to go over to the neighbor's house? When is it okay to let my children play with their friend down the street? Any thoughts on that?
I think it's a grand dress rehearsal for parenting, particularly if you got younger kids, because all families are going to do this differently. And so this is an occasion is if you're not comfortable with your kids being around a family where they're not taking the same level of precaution that you are. That's a dress rehearsal when your kid goes over to a family and they watch movies that you're not comfortable with your kids seeing. Mm-hmm. And they're not being supervised and there's more screen time and they're watching the kind of video games that you're not comfortable with. It's a great grand rehearsal in parenting for what happens when your kids are invited to be places where the rules in that place are not the same as they are for you, right. And you have to say, no, that's not a place I'm comfortable with. So we're all going to have to figure this out as we go. Mm-hmm. But I think it's a great chance to begin to rehearse. What do we do in those uncomfortable situations where we know the environment we're sending our kids to, they don't play by the same rules we do? Interesting.
You've continued your practice, throughout, you not in person, but you've continued to do the Zoom calls and phone calls. Are there any kind of trends or themes that you're seeing with, multiple couples or families or parenting dynamics that have really kind of stood out to you over the past 6 weeks that, that you would want to share for a broader audience about watch out for this or think about this?
I think what I'm seeing most is I think this pandemic at its best is teaching us what we need to know but probably didn't want to know. Huh. For instance, in marriage, just a typical story about that is marriages go through developmental stages. I do a lot of marital work with couples where I end up saying to them, this marriage is just not as good as the people in it. And what happens is marriage, you go, let's say you go 2 years is about the most you get in the infatuation stage of a marriage, right, where everything just is pretty golden. And then every marriage, nobody gets a bye, nobody gets a pass, nobody gets a detour. It's the disappointment phase in marriage. Right. That's kind of where we discover our own sinfulness and the sinfulness in each other. Right. And I never know what's harder, is to be disappointed in some of the things in our spouse or to begin to experience that we are a disappointment to our spouse. Yeah. That's about the time most couples begin to have kids. So I get them 15, 20 years later down the road. They got stuck in that disappointment phase and never learned to move from disappointment to cooperation. So it's a grand opportunity for couples to begin to sort out in this time. What are we doing that used to work but is now obsolete? What are we doing really well that we want to just grow? And what do we do that we ought to be adding on to how we go? It's a great time to kind of step back. It's sort of my metaphor, step out to 10,000 feet and just watch us. Mm-hmm. And what are we doing well, and what would it make sense? In a broader sense, I'm so struck given what I do for a living. We run no other arena of life as sloppily as we do marriage. I've heard you say that over the years, and I think it's so true. In fact, one time I remember you said if people put half as much time into their marriage as they put into choosing their children's kindergarten, wouldn't life be so much better, right? Yeah, we don't run every other arena of life. We're taking stock. What's working, what's not. Marriage, we put the darn thing on cruise control and then wonder why we get out of sync. And this is a grand opportunity because it'll tell us what we need to know. If we can do it in a non-judgmental way, in a non-critical way. I've never seen criticism have any positive motivational impact in family. But if we can just say, what are we doing well? What are we not doing well? And can we just work at that? Interesting. Well, I know you've always read and studied John Gottman, who does he's kind of the dean of marriage therapists. And so Gottman talks a lot about disappointment and how you deal with disappointment in marriages and in relationships. So what advice, either based on Gottman or your own perspective, would you tell people who are going through a time of disappointment, whether they're 5 years, 10 years, 20 years into their marriage? There again, I kind of go back. In this particular critical time, I'm looking for families to do well 5 out of 7 days. Right. And in those other 2 days, doing the best we can. But I think the disappointment, understanding that when we say we love somebody and it counts, what we're saying is, I love all the stellar things about you. But it's only in marriage and family where we know where the flaws, defects, and inadequacies reside. You know, oftentimes a couple will say, gee, if we were just like this other couple. Don't buy it. The way a couple looks on the outside is never the way it's lived on the inside. That's right. And every couple gets to sculpt their own relationship that works for them. And so just understanding that disappointment is not necessarily any indication of a character flaw in somebody. It's usually meaning that you got to develop a new set of skills, that the marriage is needing a new set of skills to develop. Not that there's something wrong with anybody, there's not something wrong with the fabric of us. If dealt with successfully most of the time, just getting the skills in place that are going to work.
Well, doesn't Gottman say, I think he says this, that one of the big differences between couples and marriages that make it, couples and marriages that don't, is how do you deal with that disappointment? Can you overcome it? Can you develop the skills to live through it? Or do you let it disillusion you so much to where you can't get past it?
In a healthy relationship, the operating ratio is 5 to 7, 5 to 8 good exchanges for every negative. So that you want to have 5 to 7 or 8 good exchanges, good interactions for every negative you got. And that suggests not the absence of negativity, overwhelming positivity. But sometimes people get bummed out when you talk disappointment. Roughly 70% of marriage issues don't resolve. We got to manage them as a dilemma.
Right.
And so if you got that operating ratio going, then when you hit that notion of all of those issues that we're not going to resolve, we just got to manage, there's not this sort of passive resignation of, oh, we got to live with it. It's okay. We learn how to manage it as a dilemma. If you're married any length of time, you know darn well there's a bunch of issues. You can beat the daylights out of that issue. It ain't going to resolve.
Right.
And learning to get good at staying focused on the things that you can resolve, and then learning how to live successfully with the things that are hard.
Well, and isn't that the difference between the solvable problems and perpetual problems? And oftentimes the perpetual problems that don't resolve are tied to personalities or tied to just fundamental differences that the couple has. And so they have to learn to acknowledge it and be prepared for it because it's not going to go away. It's not a solvable issue.
One of the sort of issues you run into a lot in my work is that whole issue of running up against the same impasse. It's the same argument running a little bit differently. And what we usually understand, this is maybe a little abstract in this conversation, but dynamic always trumps content. That once you set up a dynamic in a marriage, it doesn't matter what you put in the subject line. And if that dynamic is reactivity and you've lost your proactivity, you can, quote, diagnose reactivity in a relationship when the coupleship has lost its ability to differentiate little stuff from big stuff. That something about this big can get the same kind of intensity as something potentially life-threatening.
Interesting.
So if you don't deal with the dynamic first, you're never going to be able to solve the content.
Wow. Gottman talks about certain behaviors that all couples, whether you're married or not married, need to avoid. Can you say a word about those?
You're talking about the 4 horsemen?
The 4 horsemen,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, if I can remember them. Criticism, defensiveness, contempt is the worst.
Right.
Once contempt comes in, what's the 4th one?
Stonewalling, I think.
Stonewalling, yeah, that's the one men are good at.
Right.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right, that's right.
Don't respond.
Yeah, that's, in my most simplistic mind, having done this for 4 decades, I think I got it figured out in its most simplistic form, is what wives are most interested in is they want their husbands to be genuinely interested and curious about them. Us guys are typically pretty simple. All we need to know is that our wives like us.
Right.
And it's about that simple. Curiosity for her and just need to know you like me.
So basically men don't need to be always watching sports. There's no sports to watch right now anyway. Always watching TV, always tuning out. Pay attention to your wife and be interested and invested in her day and what she's feeling, what she's experiencing, and that makes a huge difference.
Yeah, and then I think that I want to be very careful about gender stereotypes.
Sure.
And also want to be very inclusive in terms of we're just kind of talking about the classic heterosexual relationship.
Right.
But I think that men tend to do really well with parallel activity. If she's sitting next to me watching TV, then we're together. That doesn't get it for women. It has to be interactive. We have to be going, looking at each other's eyes. And so just understanding that we work differently with each other.
Okay, I got you. Anything else that you would add to this conversation based on, the COVID quarantine period, things that you've seen with marriages, with families, things that you want parents to know? Was there anything else that you want to throw in there?
In the last few weeks, the things that I have really liked seeing. There's a story of a man, and he's now working at home, and he's got some control over his schedule. So he's just declared 11 to 12 and 4 to 5 our family PE time. And from 11 to 12 and from 4 to 5, we're all out of the house. And so people are just coming up with creative ways. The 3 boxes, I think, is a really neat visual for kids.
Right.
I think having a holding jar where a kid comes in and is really upset, and so you write down what the kid's upset about, and you say, let's put it in the jar. You validated the kid.
Right.
We'll talk about it tomorrow. About 75% of the time, that thing is gone by tomorrow,
Right.
and you're not giving a whole lot of audience to it. Just finding those tips and easy ways. For kids, I think one of the things that's working real well for families is when a kid's in a good mood, have the kid write down all the things he or she likes to do. If the kid's in a bad mood, don't, because the kid will have a very short list. But if the kid's in a good mood, then write down all the things. When a kid gets moody or starts complaining or is bored, let's go get your list. Wow. And just coming out with it. And then I think one of the things that works really well for families, lets everybody in the family choose through this period of time to get really good at something.
Well, one of the things that just jumped out at me, and I actually talked about it in the sermon this week, is, families are so overbooked with practices and plays and all, especially if you have multiple children doing activities, right? And then all of a sudden everything was canceled. And so we went from one extreme to the other extreme, but I feel like a lot of people are saying, I don't want to go back to that place where I was before, where every night of the week we had something or some things taking our kids all over town, and we didn't carve out intentional family time at home.
I think the most surprising thing for a lot of parents with this slower pace is what they're experiencing is their kids are starting to get along better. I don't have a lot of tolerance for sibling rivalry. Early in my career, I got involved with the Amish community. And it doesn't exist in that community. I got a 10-year-old girl recently in my office in a waiting room supervising, babysitting 3 younger siblings in the waiting room. There's no receptionist while I'm doing a 50-minute session in my office with the parents. That would not happen in our culture. But they've got this wonderful ability, and I don't want to idealize it because there's some real problems in that culture, that to define our family, we are a we. We are us. We're not a bunch of me's.
Right.
And so we are in this together. And we do the worst thing we can with sibling issues. We separate kids, which teaches them nothing.
Right.
But anyway, what I'm saying is people are beginning to learn at a slower pace, kids beginning to appreciate each other, beginning to get along, bringing out the better side of each other. Not in all situations, it's exposing other things as well.
Sure.
But there's some neat things happening in families that I hope we don't lose.
Yeah, there's good that's coming out, and we need to hold on to that. And whenever as we reemerge, not just rush back to life the way it was before.
I think all of us have this experience that this is changing us. We don't know how. And we really don't have a lot to say about what's going to happen on the other end of this. But we got a lot to say about who we choose to be on the other end of this. I would like parents and families and spouses and partners, I would like them to spend some time thinking about 6 months down the road, what do we want to say about how we managed ourselves through this time? What do we want to say about our coupleship? What do we want to say about our family? What do we want to say about us when we get through all of this? And beginning to live like that's going to be our goal, and let's make that happen.
I think that's great. I want to thank Jim Schleicher for coming to talk to me, and thank you for the...
One more thing?
Oh, absolutely.
Just
yeah,
one more
this is
thing.
free therapy, so
Okay,
please add whatever you like.
I just got to say this, is that the best antidote we got for anxiety is gratitude. I just want to make sure people hear that. You cannot be in a state of appreciation and be anxious at the same time. They're mutually exclusive. So for us to ask ourselves, how does a blessed person live in gratitude? That is still the best anti-anxiety medicine we got out there. Just had to get that in there.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, thank you for the advice, and I hope this is helpful to couples and families out there that have just been having to adjust a new kind of life. And I'm grateful for Jim, for his wisdom, his experience, and anytime he speaks at Woodmont or schools or other churches in town, I know it's appreciated. So thanks for talking to me, and I hope everybody is staying healthy and making your spouse and your family a priority. So I'll give you an air fist bump. Thanks, Jim.
Okay, thank you.